Hello. Today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Kristina Maria Darling, who has many roles in publishing and writing. She's a prolific poet and writer, essayist with over 30 books to her credit. She has traveled around the world doing residencies at writers and artists colonies. She is the editor-in-chief of one of the foremost poetry publishers in the United States, Tupelo Press. And she has her own consulting company on top of all of that, Penelope Consulting. And both Wilkes and Etruscan and myself, as also for several of my own books, one from the University of Tennessee and the other from Broadstone Books, we've engaged Kristina to help promote these books and get them out into the world. So welcome, Kristina Darling. Tell us a little bit about, why don't we first talk about the consulting thing? How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. For years, I was a book reviewer, and I published probably over 120 single book reviews in literary magazines. And what I loved about book reviewing is just the sense of community and connection that arose from it. So, and those connections benefited me so much when I published my own book. I mean, I did book reviews for Pleiades, the Colorado Review, and numerous other publications as a staff critic. And it was those reviews editors, Dan Beachy-Quick, Kevin Proofer, who are also wonderful poets in their own right, who wrote the blurbs for my first collection of poetry. And then once I had reviewed and built a relationship and a great rapport with these books editors, I had someone to assign my books when they were published to staff critics. And so, as you mentioned, I published numerous collections of poetry, essays, and wrote across genres. I did the publicity for every single one of those books myself, and I learned so much. I made mistakes in the beginning. I would send innumerable review copies to unoccupied editorial desks. I didn't know at first to target individual reviewers. But as time went on, I learned a lot of the tricks, right? If you can find a reviewer who has talent and a gift for reading poetry or prose, you can match them with a literary publication that is probably looking for a reviewer. There's a tremendous shortage of book reviewers in the poetry community. So the literary publication gets to champion a great small press title, and then the reviewer gets a great publication credit they wouldn't have ordinarily gotten on their own as a result of the connections that I've built over the years. So if I can use the work I've done for my own books and as a critic to help other writers, help reviewers, and help magazines champion the books that they love, it's a match made in heaven. And starting the consulting business was one of the most rewarding decisions I've ever made. I also facilitate conversations between established writers, where two, established poets or fiction writers will interview each other about their most recent books. And it's great to see those poets and writers go on to collaborate for readings, AWP panels. It's all about literary citizenship and just making connections. And if I can be the facilitator, hey, sign me up. It's a great, really rewarding role. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And you've actually introduced a lot of new people, a lot of young writers to this way of entering into literary citizenship and also into networking and making connections. I know that at Wilkes, several of our students have had reviews that you are now they're on your list and you send them. So you act kind of as a mediator between a potentially new reviewer and a site that would publish it, whether it be online or in print. How do you identify potential new people? How do they come to you?
That's a great question. So what I normally do is, I've discovered over the years that there's so many people who love books and want to get started as staff critics at a good literary journal, but they just don't know how to get started. So I host a lot of open calls on my social media. I have about 5,000 followers on Facebook alone. So I will just post an open call for reviewers to join my roster. And I've discovered some really talented critics. And, a lot of those critics who have responded to my open calls have gone on to become staff writers for Publishers Weekly, the Literary Review, the Green Mountains Review, really outstanding literary publications. And it's just a joy to follow their successes. And the other great thing about, just responding to one of these open calls and getting started as a book reviewer, you get to benefit from really great editorial feedback from the book reviews editors. And a lot of the reviewers have, spoken very highly of one of our partners, Hayden Bergman, who is the book's editor at the Literary Review. He'll line edit and, put in track changes, all kinds of comments and feedback. And so the reviewer has really polished, outstanding clips of their own writing on the web, which they can take to other journals and leverage for an assignment. That was how I started myself. I was a staff critic at a little tiny journal called Piff Magazine. Probably no one's ever heard of Piff Magazine. But I took those polished clips and I benefited from the editorial feedback. And I went on within a year to be the staff critic at the Gettysburg Review. So there's something really powerful about taking something small, like a clip of a review, in an independent literary journal and building on that, because that's how writers get launched, both in terms of criticism and their own creative work.
Kristina, aside from the obvious step of contacting you, what other advice would you have for, say, a person to embark on this journey of citizenship and of promotion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will just add that most magazines are short on reviewers. At Tupelo Quarterly, for example, we will receive, oh God, probably 500 or so, sometimes upwards of 700 or 800 packets of poetry for a single issue. We'll probably receive 100 or 200 prose pieces just for one issue. So there's no shortage of poems or stories in the literary world, but there's a huge shortage of book reviewers. We have to actively recruit critics for our reviews page and translators for our translation section. So if you want to endear yourself to an editor, write a book review. I mean, then when you send a submission of your own creative work, your poetry or a story or an essay, then that editor will know your work. They'll have a rapport with you, and that packet of poems or that short story will get an even closer read. If you are interested in getting started as a book reviewer, or just interviewing writers, asking them questions about craft and learning in that way, you can just email the magazines you admire and say, hey, I'm looking for a book review assignment. I admire your magazine. What titles are you currently seeking coverage for? And usually if you just send that to the managing editor, they will make sure it gets to the book's editor or arrives in the right hands. And that reviews editor will write you back with usually a huge list. I know at Pleiades, there's like 100 books on that list of available assignments. And usually you'll get to choose 2 or 3 titles that you want sent directly to you. They'll mail you the books and you'll work with that editor. And once you've built that rapport and you have those clips, you can build on that. And the same always goes for interviews. Magazines love publishing interviews, but we're short on interviewers most of the time.
Right. Yes, and again, those connections are just so important. I know you've set up a number of connections that I've enjoyed with Ruth Danon and Dante DiStefano in particular. And of course, the idea of the double interview, the idea of not only talking from a position of listening about one book, but each person trying to put their own book in the context of the other is really complicated and interesting. And I think that's kind of original. I haven't seen that approach before, but it's kind of an panel, I mean, it's a before the panel, you have the duo. So I think that's a really interesting approach. You mentioned Tupelo Press, and I'm just curious, how do you handle the great volume of submissions that you receive? What tell me about that process as a book publisher and editor?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting process, and I'm so glad you asked about that. So typically with a first book contest, or something like the Dorset Prize, which is for mid-career poets as well as emerging poets, we'll receive probably 800 to 1100 manuscript submissions, and these are full book submissions. So it's a lot to read through, as you can imagine. With our July Open this year, we received 1,400 submissions. But for me, this is just a great opportunity. It's too many submissions to read by myself. So I thought, why not open it up and bring in other perspectives and other voices into the gatekeeping process. So when I took over as editor-in-chief, my mission was to create panels of preliminary readers. And so we've had all female panels of preliminary judges. We've had all non-binary panels of preliminary judges. We've had panels of judges that are mostly writers of color, and then the other judges are women or non-binary folks. I love bringing, other voices and other perspectives into the gatekeeping process, because if I'm left to my own devices, I'm going to choose some prose poetry, usually by a feminist writer. That is my comfort zone. That's my wheelhouse. So what I love about inviting more diversity in terms of perspectives and voices into the gatekeeping process is that it challenges me to, pay attention and listen carefully to work that I wouldn't normally gravitate toward, and really see the merits in poetry that may be much different from my own, or the writer might come from a background much different from my own. And so what I've loved about these panels of preliminary judges, in addition to empowering writers of color and other historically marginalized groups as gatekeepers, it's really pushed me to expand my sensibility and hopefully become an even better editor and a better listener and a better reader in terms of poetry.
Well, I think that theme of social action and participation, you mentioned the word citizenship earlier, is certainly runs through your various roles. I mean, in terms of your editing, as with Tupelo, that's a great example. In terms of the way you've set up interviews, I know that when you ask questions, for instance, from editors, and you run at the Kenyon Review, you do a series of interviews with editors, and the questions that you ask oftentimes touch on the social responsibility or the social possibilities, the cultural and political possibilities inherent in this industry. And yet, at the same time, of course, the industry is dominated by a very intransigent, you might say, and urban capitalist-based program. Talk about that. How does somebody fit in or try to change that dynamic in all the different ways that you've worked?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that, because that's one of the reasons I fell in love with small press publishing. When I was a young person, I remember seeing the power being in the hands of the few in terms of who gets published, who makes choices, and what books are made available to readers. And when I was in college, that was when all of these lit journals were popping up online. People were making zines and starting chapbook series. And I was just astounded, when you place the power in the hands of the many, it was such a richer, more vibrant, and more representative literary landscape. And yeah, that was one of the reasons I chose to become an editor. But in terms of activism and literary citizenship, it can take many forms. Starting a chapbook series, running a press is only one. With my poetry criticism, I only review books by under-theorized writers. And I think that this is so important because, the poet Dan Beachy-Quick, who's a great colleague and a poet that I look up to, he has always said that a book review or a piece of poetry criticism should open up possibilities. And so for me, part of that activism is shining a light and opening up possibilities for conversation for books that may not have received that critical discourse and attention. And so yeah, book reviews are more than just promotion, and they're more than just like ad copy, which I think is part of the bad rap that they get in the poetry world. Serious poetry criticism can really start dialogue and redirect the focus of scholarly attention. And when thinking about, poetry and readership, that can be a really powerful gesture.
That's so interesting because, of course, you bring not only to your reading and criticism, but to your writing, this sensibility of how to negotiate the various modalities you mentioned earlier about prose poetry, but you write essays, you write traditionally lined, lineated poems, prose poems, hybrid. You've done work in collaboration in books with other writers. I know for myself, it's oftentimes awkward as an editor and writer, because when I receive work, no matter what it is, it's finished, it's done, and therefore it's better than what I'm doing because mine isn't done. And I'm wondering how you negotiate that dual role. On the one hand, you're obliged to select and therefore to reject many more people than you actually can accept. And on the other hand, you're attempting to make a name and to get into that world from the writer's point of view. How does that work for you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and also a really tough dilemma for a lot of writers. I think one of the biggest myths that circulates about editors is that, oh, editors have no time to write, and editors are, serving other people's poetry at the expense of their own creative work. I think this is such a misconception because for me, being a poet is being in a community, and it is, those relationships that fuel your creative work. For example, I went to grad school at SUNY Buffalo, which is really innovative program that foregrounds publishing and professional development. And they give students grants to start their own small press publications. So of course, I enthusiastically applied for the small press grant. I started a small press called Noctuary, which published for a number of years writing by women that exists beyond, in spite of, and against genre boundaries. So all of those unclassifiable texts that couldn't find a home elsewhere because they didn't fit neatly into the submission categories. And so what I found was when I went into this editorial project, I thought that, hybrid writing by women and non-binary writers is just one thing. It's prose poems and maybe the occasional flash fiction. And when I saw the submissions and started reaching out to writers and soliciting them, I was just astonished by the multifarious array of what is possible within this very narrow subgenre. And so, editing for me expanded my sense of what was possible within a genre where I was already working. I can't tell you how many times I will look at a submission or, a manuscript and say, wow, I didn't know a writer could do that. And so it's really fun. You get a sneak peek at what other writers are working on. It expands and pushes your own sensibility as a poet, but also it can be very strategic. And I'm saying this to anyone who's working on a lit journal or reading submissions. They will know exactly what I mean. You see the submissions come in. If everybody's writing Halloween poems, you might say, hey, I'm going to write a Christmas poem. It gives you a sense of how to stand out from the crowd. And so I would just encourage anyone who's, participating in an editorial role to think about, that is an opportunity to learn how to present your own work. Because, for me, I learned so much about what editors find professional, as well as, in terms of manuscript submissions. At Tupelo Press, I can tell you with confidence, every manuscript submission, pretty much, I'd say 80% of them are left margin poetry. And so if you do something interesting with the space of the page, you're going to command that editor's attention because it's something different. That will also tell you, okay, this is a writer who's willing to take risks and has the confidence to take risks. And so, that will really, it gives a commanding presence for that submission. So you learn just how to present and kind of advocate for your own work, just being on the other side is submittable, if you will.
Right. No, I love that idea that there's a kind of connection between, what you not only read, but what you're reading for the first time. I mean, as an editor, you have the privilege of seeing something without a context. You probably never heard of this person and you have no idea, what they have besides their tiny little cover letter. And we realize that all other reading that we do is pretty much in a context. It's a book or a friend or a student. And it's already shaped as a reading experience for us. But the editor shapes for herself and therefore enters perhaps into their own praxis as writers. And that's very exciting, that synergy between those two activities as long as things are kept open like that. And you mentioned also something that really struck me about the program at SUNY Buffalo, which I know about. It's a really great program. I went to SUNY Binghamton, so I was a little bit south. But Buffalo, one of the things that they were known for, of course, is the sense of getting into the community, getting into the professional world. Certainly one of the stereotypes about being a poet is that you're going to live in a garret and you're going to be really poor, and it's just a totally uneconomically viable way of being in the world. And yet you have gone around the world, many, Fondazione Valparaiso, Hawthorne and Castle, Yaddo, the Italian, recently you were in Italy on a grant, all funded by your poetry. Tell us how you've made a life in writing and editing and consulting.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that people just, as you were saying, they make this assumption that there's no money out there for poetry. But there are so many artist residencies, literary fellowships, where you can not only have time and space to write and work on your project, but you can be cared for, have all your meals prepared for you. And Hawthorne and Castle even has a laundry service, imagine that. But they also give you the gift of community. And that was why I just became an artist residency addict. I would meet so many interesting writers, composers, sculptors, painters, and would go on to collaborate with them. I actually am working with composer Dale Trumbore on a setting of some of my poetry to be performed by a chorus. And so, it's super exciting to do these kinds of collaborative projects. But in terms of residencies, most writers just don't know what's out there for them. So if you just simply go to the Alliance of Artists Communities website, it's a directory of every residency pretty much within the United States. They tell you how many people applied, how many people got in, the application deadline, and the application fee, which is great for strategic purposes. You know, if you see 2,000 applications, 100 accepted, you say, okay, maybe I need a backup. I need a tiered list of residencies, you know, like with colleges. You have your reach school, you have your good fit schools, then you have your backups. But there are some simple tricks to applying for these residencies and grants too, that I'm happy to share with you all. So first, you need to have a project proposal that focuses on a single project. Single-mindedness of purpose is powerful with applications. I've served on the juries of a lot of these fellowships. And I can't tell you how many poets and writers will say, okay, I have 3 things percolating. I'm going to kind of decide later. Don't do that in your project proposal. Focus on one thing. If you are not good at talking about your own work, which is a common thing with writers and poets, read reviews of books you love, because that will give you a language for speaking about your discipline and your craft. So read reviews, you know, use that as a source of vocabulary and language. And then once you've written your project proposal, the project proposal is your plan for what you're going to do at the residency. The work sample that you submit should match the project proposal, because the project proposal shows single-mindedness of purpose, and the work sample shows that you have the technical facility, the skills, and the artistic training to carry out that project. And so, you know, writers feel all kinds of pressure to, you know, show that they're so worldly and they can do all of these things in their work sample, but really a concise body of work is what jurors and decision makers in the arts find compelling. So, you know, for years when I applied for residencies, I was the classical music prose poem person. And, you know, that makes it easy to remember for a juror that's reading 100 or even 2,000 applications. You know, for another application cycle, I was the footnote poet, writing poems and footnotes. But you know, that's easy to call to mind when the juries meet and discuss the applications. So yeah, those are just some tricks of the trade, and I hope they're helpful.
Well, this is very helpful and incredibly eclectic and wide-ranging, and we're delighted to have you here, both as part of the Wilkes program, and we've done site supervision before, and also for Etruscan as our consultant and guide through all of this material. Thank you so much, Dr. Kristina Maria Darling.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Likewise, looking forward.